Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Today we're going to pick up on where Billy Teals, Dr. Billy Teals, left off in January, where he built a reason to treat our yards, our backyard habitats, is an important piece of what we do and an important piece of nature. Today, he gave us the how, or the why we did it. Today he's going to give us the how. It's pretty exciting. How many people were here last time? Almost everyone. That's fantastic. And we have some new people. How many people saw the article in the paper last time or this time? So very nice articles. Very nice articles. If you can go back and archive it if you get the paper and read the first one. It's very good. So without further ado, turn it over to Dr. Teals to talk about our backyard habitats.
Thanks. So we are going to start off where we left off, and just a little bit. We did have the piece in the paper this time. I opened up the Hood County News, and I noticed on the second page there was an article that was entitled "Lawn Care and Management." I thought, well, I got interviewed by Ashley Inge earlier in the week, and I thought that's the article that she interviewed me about. And I started reading it. There's nothing about what I was talking about. It was about lawn care and management, how to grow turf grass. So I saw a little humor in the irony of that. And one part of the paper was teaching people how to do the exact opposite of what I'm trying to encourage people to do. So a little humor. So remember, we talked about protecting our backyards together. So nationwide, we could have what Doug Ptolemy calls a homegrown national park. We're not advancing here. So I'm going to advance it. It's not advancing with the computer either. All right, thank you, Amy. So his argument is, if we have 40 million acres of turf grass in this nation, that if enough of us got together, if, say, all of us got together and put together half of our yards, which is what he suggests, that we could have 20 million acres of habitat, which would go a long way to connecting all these fragments of habitat. Our nation is losing habitat hand over foot. And one of the ways he proposes to go against this would be for all of us to take personal responsibility to establish our own habitat in our own backyards. They had these 10 points, which we'll cover today. Again, this is a how-to. Last time we covered about the dire need for us all to do this and for us to take personal responsibility. I got a lot of comments after the last talk about you really didn't tell us anything about what we need to do. And is there a checklist that you can send us through to establish backyard habitat? Well, there is kind of, and this is with the National Wildlife Federation certification program. It's called Backyard Habitat Certification. You can see how many people have actually participated in this program. How many in here have participated in that? So you can go online to National Wildlife Federation, and they'll give you instructions on what you need to do to become certified. Basically, what you're trying to do is establish food, cover, and water for wildlife. And there is a checklist. So under food, there are certain kinds of plants that you can plant for food, same thing for cover, and the same thing for water. But what it doesn't do is tell you specifically what species of plant to plant, which is good. I mean, it's our backyard. We can plant whatever we want to plant, but this gives you some guidance. And when it's all said and done, whenever you do become certified, they'll send you a sign that you can hang in your yard. As we learned last week, these signs and the fact that you're certified can get you somewhere. There are some homeowners associations that will accept a certified backyard habitat as meeting their homeowner covenants restrictions. In fact, that's what we're proposing in the Bentwater subdivision where we live. The fact that it's registered. But, you know, you have to talk to your homeowners association, and like we did, we had to propose amendments to our covenants, which is a big constraint. You know, I'll say that up front. If you live in town and you have a homeowners association, it might not be your soils or your climate or whatever in establishing backyard habitat. It may be your homeowners association. But work with them. So here's where we left off. We said, we need to shrink the size of our lawn, and Ptolemy suggests at least 50%. So again, he's saying you can still have lawn, but you can have habitat as well. And the goal should be to shrink it at least 50%. There is a publication by Natural Resource Conservation Service here in Texas that I was going to reproduce and have handouts for, but you can go online and get it. In the name of saving paper, I would just go to Natural Resources Conservation Service, texas.nrcs.usda.gov, and look under wildlife and look under habitat. And it makes some important points that Ptolemy doesn't. And the very first thing is something that's been ingrained to us, those of us who work with the Soil Conservation Service. The first thing you need to do is conduct an inventory. An inventory of what you already have. And you start with the soils and then you go to the plants. And the reason is there may be limitations on the soil that you have. Some soils in this region are prairie soils. Others are cross timber soils. And it's a whole lot easier to work with nature and the soils that you have than to work against it. And whether it's a prairie soil, which you might want to look at using grasses as your primary feature, or a cross timber soil where you might want to use woody species as your primary feature, you may have shallow ends of both of those. In other words, the soil is so shallow that it might not grow anything without amending the soil. And I'll show some examples of this. And there are those of us that live on a floodplain soil or a terrace soil, which is deep and they'll grow anything without any amendments. So you're fortunate if you have one of those because you can grow either grasses or trees without much problem. So this is a typical yard that is managing for wildlife in a woodland habitat. And you can see where this person or persons is managing lots of different woody species with grass walkways in between the places where he's trying to grow the natural habitat. Now I look at that and I think, as pretty as it is, that's a lot of maintenance. Somebody's got to weed and edge around all that, plus maintain the vegetation that's in the plot. This is our yard in Bentwater. And basically all I do to manage it is managing the timing of my mowing. And I'll show you some examples of what we're trying to accomplish in the yard. So we have this area here in front, which is a natural habitat that is mowed none between the 4th of July and the beginning of the next year, or the other way. It's mowed from the 4th of July through the growing season, but then not mowed after the growing season to the 4th of July. So we're mowing it in 4th of July until the winter. And what that does is promote cool season forbs, I'm going to call them, not weeds, cool season forbs, such as Indian paintbrush, which is in bloom right now, and blue bonnets. Later, there'll be another aspect come in, which will be dominated by milkweeds. And later, up around the 4th of July, it'll be filled with Mexican hemps. So that's one. This area right here is a tall grass prairie. And it looks like a tall grass prairie. We mow it once a year after the growing season. That's all. And it's a deep prairie soil, deep for this area, which is about, 2.5 foot of the limestone. This area over here, the soil begins to get shallow. So it won't grow tall grasses because the roots of tall grasses actually need a couple of feet of depth to sink their teeth into before they can establish. So there's mixed grasses over here where Sidose grama is the dominant grass. And back here is managed much like the front yard. And it gets really shallow back here. Our lot slopes this way. There's a bluff, edge of a bluff right there. So back away from the front of the lawn, it gets shallower and shallower and shallower. You notice we have a big garden there. I would have liked to put the garden in the front yard where the soil was deep, but it's not there. So you have to amend the soil. This gets back to the soil and inventory in your soil to begin with. So there's over 400 tons of topsoil that I had hauled, which cost, at the time around $5,000. Which, it depends on where your priorities are, I guess. But, even then it has to be managed. I can't let water run across it toward the back of the lot or it'll all wash down on the neighbors. So I have to have a rim around the garden to divert the water around it. So essentially, no water is leaving the garden except what falls on it and percolates through the soil, which is another problem. I did that and I didn't think about my drainage. So I had subsurface flow that goes downhill, and it was acting a lot like that seed area that we have at the Nature Center. So, I had to put artificial drainage in it to have plants not have their roots soaked in the water. So, all that comes into play. And again, that's why you need to do an inventory and have these things sort of planned out before you begin. So that's the front of the house. And again, that's our little wildflower management sign that's put up to satisfy the homeowners association.
Billy, we've got a request on Zoom that they can't see where your pointer is. So if you could describe a little bit to them when you're talking about something specific so they can understand which piece of the picture you're talking about.
Well, I could point with my hand.
I don't think that'll help them.
That's right. They're just see the slide.
Yeah, all they see is the slide, so.
All right. So this is the side yard where the soil is sort of shallow, and all that reddish that you're seeing in there is Sidose grama. And this is the tall grass portion of the yard that only gets mowed once a year after the growing season. In fact, I let it stand because my neighbors and us like the looks of the reddish tall grasses. So we mow it in late January or February. About when we would do a controlled burn at the Nature Center, or when we begin to mow at the Nature Center. So about all I do in these areas after they become established is control my invasive species, and that's number 2 on his list. So invasive species can be anything, really. I always like the definition of a weed as a plant out of place. We have lists of invasive species in Texas, but really, you can have an invasive species anywhere. what are we? There it is. I got it.
Okay.
So, for instance, we try to control juniper up at the nature center. Juniper is a native species, but it can become a weed. There is a website with the Native Plants of Texas, the Collin County chapter, that lists the dirty dozen invasive species in this area. And I like it because not only does it list the species, but it gives you the native alternative. And it more or less describes what the function of that species might be.
What is that website?
It's the Native Plant Society of Texas, and this is the Collin County chapter.
Thank you.
And you can see on the top of their list is Bermuda grass. If you went to the workshop on April 17th, you'd be learning how to manage it. Here, you're going to learn how to kill it. There's also an invasive species database here in Texas that lists a whole lot more than 12. And there it is. There's up at the top left-hand corner is the site. So let's talk about a few of them. So Bermuda grass is on the top of most lawn people's list. And my yard, the front yard is Bermuda grass. I wish it was buffalo grass, but the effort that it would take to kill the Bermuda and put the buffalo grass is more than I want to invest. So I don't. But there are places where you might want a turf type grass, like in between your plots of native grass or your woody vegetation. Bermuda grass is tough because it reproduces asexually. It doesn't reproduce by seed. It reproduces through underground rhizomes or stolons, which are basically horizontal stems above the ground. So it will spread. It's a weed in crop fields. It's a weed where you don't want it in lawns. And a lot of people have problems with herbicides, but I say when it comes to invasives, I don't want to keep going back and redoing it. So whenever we do invasive control out at the nature center, we will go ahead and use an herbicide to keep that area as much as possible from replenishing itself. And as long as you're not using wide scale application, you're just spot treating something, it's not a big problem. But the last thing I would do is to use like 2,4-D across my whole lawn, or use Roundup to put in my garden to do Roundup ready crops. Broad scale application is not good for the environment. If you're just killing a plant here or there, that's generally not enough to cause a runoff problem. Generally, it dries up pretty quickly after the application. So there are places where herbicides, I think, have a place. And this is the other grassy species that's a problem. That's King Ranch bluestem. And it's everywhere. And it has a growth form a whole lot like our tall native grasses. It can have a very deep root system, but it reseeds also. And the seedlings of it, even though they can make fairly broad rosettes on the ground, don't have a very deep root system, and they can be hoed up. So with it, the way I do it is for the big parent plant, I will use an herbicide on it. And for the little plants that come up from seed, I'm going to hoe them. If I could hoe the whole thing up, I would. But it's difficult, very difficult. And they will come back. That's why, that's the reason that I would use an herbicide on a grass like that with a deep root system. So on the woody side, and I'm going to talk our problems out at the Nature Center. This is probably the number one problem. I don't know how many of you have been to Cleveland State Park. If you look in the understory, it's just solid privet. And that particular privet right there is Chinese privet. There are a couple other types of privet, but they don't seem to be as much a problem as Chinese privet is. In fact, we even have a few of those at our Nature Center right here. And again, we control them by clipping them down and using an herbicide on the recently cut stump. There's another one that we have a problem with. Again, you may have different woody plants that are invasives. You may have different herbaceous plants that are invasives. But these are the four in this county that are probably the worst for lawns, I would say. So Dalmy says plant keystone general. So what are keystone general? So he's done enough research. He's pointed out the fact that there are a few plants that produce the greatest amount of environmental function. It's not everything. You want to have a great diversity of plants in your landscape, but there are a few that are better than others. So where he lives in the eastern United States, he says that oak, willow, cherry, pines, and poplar are producing the greatest number of caterpillars. So if you're looking at caterpillar production, and the reason that's important is because that's the principal food for most songbird species in the United States, you would take a look at those species. But we're not in the eastern United States. And it's hard to look at a landscape here and say that these species are going to work here, or these genera are going to work here. But we do have our own species. And it's kind of hard to argue with the end point of 4 billion years of evolution about the plants that were there to begin with not having the greatest amount of environmental function. So he has got a database that you can go to. You type out where you are in the country, and theoretically it'll give you the plants that you're supposed to plant. But I found that kind of shallow, and I don't particularly agree with some of the plants that he recommends. So I'm going to talk about, what you should do as opposed to that. And again, know your soils and know your ecoregion. What was here to begin with? So we all have this map, and whenever we take our master naturalist course, and we here in Hood, Johnson, and Somerville County are in 2 ecoregions. Number 3, which is a prairie, we're in this lobe right here, which is called the Fort Worth Prairie. But again, dark soils over limestone, some of about 2 feet deep. And this ecosystem here are the cross timbers. So this is the east cross timbers, and this is the west cross timbers. So if you look at what the dominance of those 2 ecoregions are, you can see that we have, for the cross timber areas, mostly woody species. Let me go back. Although it occurs in a savanna, so it's not just woody species. There are grass species there as well. And one of the dominant trees there is this. This is a post oak. Problem with post oak is they're not very commercially available. You can get them, but they're coming from way outside of Texas. So, what I said last time was, if you've got one, cherish it, because it's going to provide environmental function, more so than any other plant that you would plant in the cross timbers area. And this is the other one, which is blackjack oak. Again, it's not going to be commercially available, but if you've got them, go ahead and keep them. Neither one of them in this area get to be shade trees unless you're growing them on floodplain soils, but they make beautiful little trees out in the lawn, and I've seen a lot of them grow. We have them in our subdivision. The structure of them, particularly post oak, have big limbs all the way out toward the end, and they're sturdy. They hold up real well, and they just have a beautiful shape. One that'll grow both in cross timbers and in the prairie sections is live oak. Here, I'd make sure that you get plateau live oak and not Virginia live oak. Virginia live oak grows in the coastal plain, and plateau live oak grows in this section of Texas. And I say that if you notice trees from the 2021 freeze that we had, there are quite a few live oaks that didn't make it through that. And 5 will get you 10 that they planted Virginiana rather than fusiformis. And it's hard to tell the difference. And most nurseries won't even label them. They'll just call them live oak. The species name on plateau live oak is fusiformis, and that's because of the shape of the acorn. It's long and slender. It's fusiform. So I would ask your nursery before you ever bought a tree, whether it's plateau live oak or whether it's Virginia live oak. And if they won't tell you, try to get one that's plateau somewhere else. We have a couple of red oaks that do real well. This is Shumard right here, which makes a huge tree. Again, it will grow on bottomland soils. It'll grow on upland soils, but it doesn't grow on upland soils as well as Texas red oak, which looks very much like this tree, only it's smaller and more adapted to shallow soil areas. If you want to take a look at any of these trees, come up to the nature center. We have a tree trailer that takes you through the forest, and all the trees that we have up there are labeled. We just got through labeling, so this would be a good time while everything's still up. If you're in the bottom, bur oaks are a good option. So, what he said about planting keystone genera holds here as well. We just wouldn't have the same species of oaks as he does in the eastern United States, where oak hickory are the dominant trees in them. There's blackjack post oak and prairie. So how many have this tree in their yard? It's a Mexican plum. Yeah. It's a pretty popular tree. Great smaller tree. If you're doing a backyard habitat and you choose trees as one of your features, it's good to have some large trees and some small trees and some shrubs. So this would be a small tree. Has beautiful flowers. It's already flowered and it's already setting fruit. This fruit doesn't produce until the fall. Most plums will produce June, when we would pick sand plums. So this one produces much later. This is rusty black haw by Burnham. It's really good because if it's out in the open, it produces these small fruit. Generally, small fruits are better for birds than large fruits. Again, if you want to take a look at what one looks like in the wild, come to the tree trail. We just got through labeling this one. So this is possum paw or deciduous holly. And another good tree, small tree, would be yopon. Yopon keeps its leaves throughout the growing season. Deciduous holly or possum paw loses its leaves. And this is Carolina buckthorn. They're all natural here. And again, If you want to see it in a natural setting, go up to our wooded ravine at the Nature Center. That is American beautyberry. It's not a small tree. It's a shrub. Only gets about waist high and loaded with berries. The berries are eaten. Practically all berries get eaten sooner or later. Some of them don't get eaten until after they raisin up and fall off the plant, but practically all berries are eaten by some species of wildlife. And part of our region, part of our yard should be prairie. Our region is called the tall grass prairie. The blackland prairies, which includes the Fort Worth prairie, which I talked about, that lobe that's in between the east and west cross timbers, has these 4 species as the dominant. That's big blue stem. That's little blue stem, which under the natural conditions was the most prevalent of the 4 species of grasses. That's switchgrass and that's Indian grass. Now, most places around here have been grazed so much that it'd be hard to find these species. But you can find them as either seed or young plants in different vendors across Texas. As I mentioned before, it's kind of hard on shallow soils to establish tall grasses because the soil is going to allow for the root systems to develop. So shorter grasses. You go up to the Nature Center and we have tall grass prairie that's kind of in the middle of the Nature Center between the Education Center and the parking lot. Has about a 20-inch depth over limestone. That grows tall grasses like the ones that we've seen before beautifully. But the soils away from that start to shallow. And they never were. Even back before European settlement, they never were tall grass. So they were different kinds of grasses. Up there we have meadow dropseed and rough tridents. And those were the dominant grasses in that more shallow area. And you get away from that and you even get buffalo grass, another warm season grass that would have been the dominant. You overgraze those different areas and sooner or later you don't get warm season grasses at all. You'll get cool season grasses that will replace the warm season grasses because they're more tolerant to grazing. Species like Texas winter grass, or you go up there now and it's just beautifully green. All that green you see are winter annual grasses, most of which are introduced. Either cheap grass or the one that we have mostly up there is Japanese brown. So if you're grazing, you're going to have grass for another few weeks, and then they're like wheat. They turn off brown and straw. But these warm season grasses are green throughout the summer. So both for grazing management and, I think for beauty, it's the tall warm season grasses or the short warm season grasses. And with them, there are hundreds of forms. So let's take the Nature Center again, for example. In the tall grass portion of the Nature Center, we have 4 grasses that probably compose 90% of the biomass, excuse me. You look out there and you say, well, it's warm season grasses, but if you burn it or you mow it, you begin to notice how many forbs there are in that. And it's the whole thing together that makes it help. The greater the diversity, the greater the function. So don't think that this is all just warm season grasses. It's a number of things. All right, establishing woody plants is fairly straightforward. Either you're planting bare rooted seedlings, or you're planting potted material. With warm season grasses, to get them established, there's a couple of ways. And one is by seeding, which I think for backyards is probably not a good thing to do. It's better if you're working on a small area to get containerized plants. They're exceedingly difficult. You can try it if you want to. I've tried it when I was working with NRCS, and if I had 1 out of 3 that was successful, I thought I was lucky. How many have tried it? Bob, have you tried to seed with warm season grasses?
Yes, I have.
How successful was your planting?
On the larger scale, with cedar, not great. I actually had better luck just dragging brush behind. And at the house, but I seeded really heavily. I've had a few grasses coming in, particularly buffalo grass, but that's not fall grass.
Yeah, but it is a native warm season grass. So you have to be careful when you seed. You seed shallow. You can see how deep those are, like 1/4 of an inch deep. And you're only seeding 3 pounds per acre, which is not a lot. That's the recommended seeding rate. And they're small and feathery. It takes a long time for them to come up. And then once they come up, you don't know they're there because in the first or second year, they're so tiny. And if you have any other plant in there with them, you'll see whatever the other plant is and not them. So to evaluate it, it takes about 3 years. And you think about it, if it's a failure, then you've waited 3 years to decide if it's a failure. So I'd say your success rate is better than mine doing it with this is what's called a no-till plant. And it's designed to seed these little tiny native grass seeds. That is the row it lays down. And then it has these hoppers here where the seed fall through the hoppers and down into that little trench that the machine has drilled. Again, if you're doing large scale, you're talking about both with your yard and with your place out at your ranch. So you're doing 2 different kinds of seedings. You're doing one with no-till drill and the other with just rubbing the soil and then putting the grass in.
That's correct, but I would say I had more success even at the ranch broadcasting and dragging juniper limbs behind it than I did with the no-till drill. I think it just wasn't set quite right. It was probably planted too deep.
Well, at any rate, before you even start, you need to get a weed-free, firm seed base. So, you're going to tear up whatever you have in there for a while to get these established. So, again, not many yards, when we're talking backyard habitat, want to go through all that. But there are these pocket prairies that are springing up everywhere. And the Native Prairies Texas Association has got a good website on pocket prairie gardening. So it turns out that you can get just about any native species through plugs or container materials. And if you're doing small areas, you can do one year and one another year if you want to go that far. He's got her work cut out. She doesn't look too damn happy. So that's the end result. So, and I've noticed with most of the pocket prairies that they don't just stick with the native grasses. They throw in some forbs as well, like this one. And I mentioned last time, this is another reason to do the inventory, right? Sometimes you have grasses there that you don't know that are there at all. And they'll be so tiny and mixed in with other things. So this is my neighbor's yard. See all that red? That's not Bermuda grass. Most of it's King Ranch blue stem, but within that King Ranch blue stem, there were little roots of native grass. And if you can eliminate the competition, then that native black grass will increase and start new plants. So not everybody has this. A lot of you have yards that have been stripped of its vegetation and had turf grass hauled in, and that wouldn't work at all. But if you haven't had that, you'd be surprised what is either in the seed base or there as little roots. And if they're there as little roots, it's a whole lot easier to deal with an established plant than it is to try to seed something, particularly herbaceous plants like grasses. Now, I have had to control invasives on that. So I'm choosing the plants that I want and eliminating the ones that I don't. And again, in these native grass plots, especially those that were there to begin with, there's a seed base at the forbs as well. So there are all these plants in our yard. We have, native grasses, maybe 5 or 6 dominant native grasses, but there are over 100 other plants, forbs, in our yard as well. In the Nature Center, we have over 450 different species of plants there. And they were there. It's probably never been cultivated and never had a turf grass yard put over it. But take a look and see what's there. The way you do that is don't mow it. Don't mow it and see what comes up. And if stuff comes there that you like, well, you maintain it, and if you don't, then you get rid of it. There are a couple of references about how to landscape with native plants that are good ones here in Texas. George Miller's book, and then Conrad Bender's book. Most of these are kind of Central Texas flavored. So the species aren't going to be the same here as they are wherever the book was developed, which both of them were developed in Central Texas. So Ptolemy's fourth point is be generous with your plantings. And diversity is the spice of life. Diversity is key to any functional ecosystem. We talked about that last time. Remember, we talked about the triangles. That was a small triangle that had all the different representatives of the food chain in it, and one that was the bigger one that was more diverse. Those have greater ecological functions. The more species you have, the greater the ecological function. So when you plant, think about that. Try to be as diverse as you can with your plantings. Leopold had a nice saying about that. It says, things tends to be right when it preserves the diversity, the beauty, and the integrity of nature. And it tends to be wrong when it does otherwise. So plant for special pollinators. And there's a book on this, and she's written several, one on bees and one on pollinators in general by Heather Home. And she's in the north central United States, but the genera of both the insects and the plants are applicable here too. So that's a good reference for deciding what to plant when you're considering pollinators. Again, I would look locally as to what to plant. And a good place to start would be up here at our butterfly garden. And another good place to start would be the demonstration downtown behind the place where we all vote, the county building. Now, not all those places, not all the species there are native. So make sure that you're using something native. All of ours up at the butterfly garden is. And butterflies, of course, they're pollinators, and we see the same beauty in plants as they do. I mean, the reason why native plants attract butterflies is they're trying to get pollinated. That's the strategy of the plant, right? So they are getting pollinated, but they add beauty to our landscape according to our aesthetics. So we have all the plants, or most of them, at the butterfly garden labeled. So again, that's one of the reasons why you might want to go up there and check things out. And it's kind of the same thing there. The more different kinds of plants that you have, the better things are. Some plants are particularly important to different species of insects. Of course, the monarch is the big thing. We have monarch way stations that different places and different cities, of course, us up at our butterfly garden participate in. If you qualify, you get a little butterfly way station sign that you can put in your plot. And as beautiful as butterflies are, and as beautiful as the plants that they come to, they are not the most important pollinators. The most important pollinators are bees, native bees. So it's a good idea and your concept of pollination to go ahead and plant things that bloom at day, things that bloom at night, like this datura, which is a Jimson weed. It's extremely poisonous, so it won't be in most people's catalogs. Blooms at night, attracts moths. Here's a plant that, if you wanted to attract butterflies, you definitely would like to have. That's blue mist flower, Greg's blue mist flower. Wendy and Dave have, how many monarchs did you tag just coming to the mist flower bed? 250, and I ran out of tags.
Wow.
So it's not just milkweeds that you need for butterflies. You need the plants that they use as nectar plants. So it turns out we have over 4,000 species of native bees, and most of them live in the ground. When you say bees, most people have a misconception. Most people think of honeybee, which is actually a bee, but it's old world. It's from Europe and Asia, even Africa, and those bees would pollinate what? Yeah, they would pollinate the plants that were there, but we brought tons of plants from there to here, and they are the best pollinators of crops and legumes such as alfalfa, and so they're important. They even pollinate native plants, but not to the degree that our own native bees would. So when we're talking planting for bees, we ought to be talking about planting native plants. And again, go back to what was here to begin with. All those forbs that are associated with the grasses would be good native bee plants. This is Heather Holman, and she has a good book on bees as well as the one she has on pollinators in general. Ptolemy says studies across the United States, the ones for native bees would fall into these categories. That's a willow. That's black willow, which we have here. And these are asters of the genus, what used to be aster. They call it something else now. That's a goldenrod, and this is a sunflower of the genus Helianthus. And again, I'd say don't get hung up on specifically the species to plant here, as long as it's native. Network with neighbors. So I mentioned this last time. This is our house right here. But in Bentwater, we have 4 houses in a row that are managing our backyards for wildlife. So why would you want to do that anyway? Why would networking with neighbors be important?
Doesn't make them mad.
Well, you have to. If we didn't have neighbors that were cooperative, we wouldn't be able to do this. But it's better, the bigger area that you can restore, the better off you are. So we're not just having fragmented restorations, which is the problem to begin with. We're having a block of restorations, which means more ecological. And it also helps if you have, whenever the homeowners association comes out and says, your lawn's out of compliance, for all 4 of the families to go down together and say, yeah, but we thought we weren't doing this, and look at the values of this. And that's why we had amendments in our homeowners association to try to let people that wanted to manage for their yards to be able to do so and still meet covenants requirement. Build a conservation hardscape. All this is saying is it's not all plants. You know, put up boxes, put in backyard ponds and pools, put up bird feeders, do anything that you can to enhance the wildlife. But don't do just that. If you did just that, you wouldn't be providing much environmental function, which you'd be attracting birds to your backyard. Just some examples. There's a different box for every group of birds. There are wren boxes, there are bluebird boxes, there are owl boxes, there are wood duck boxes. We have them all out at the nature center. There are bat boxes. And Tim put together this bee house right here. Yeah. Which are little tubes that are set into this little house, which provides bees not only a place to pollinate around our butterfly garden, but gives them a place such as a nesting box. That Tim that just got through introducing. Tim Edgemont. Create soft landings under your trees. And here's Ptolemy's point on this one, is that you're planting these keystone species or maintaining them. And you're producing these caterpillars up in the trees, but if you don't provide a place for them underneath the tree to complete their life cycle, then you shortcut that process and you won't have the same results if you didn't do that. So this can be done and done attractively. Shouldn't mow, you shouldn't put plastic down underneath your tree. That's a Central Texas yard. And you can see the person not only has got planting under the trees, but he's mulched it as well. And this is what you're striving for. Don't spray or fertilize. So if you spray your yard and use something like 2,4-D to favor the grasses, then you're wiping out all the pores, all the wildfires. That's what that's for. 2,4-D is very specific. It allows grasses to grow, but it will kill the broadleaves. And there are other, I shouldn't just point out 2,4-D. There are other broadleaves herbicides that are recommended. If you go to that lawn management care seminar, you'll find out exactly which ones not to use. And native plants just don't need fertilization. In fact, if you fertilize your yard and it has Bermuda grass in it, for example, you're going to stimulate the Bermuda grass, and the native grasses it won't help them at all. So you're favoring the Bermuda grass if you fertilize. So we do fertilize the garden, but it's cut off. We try to manage the runoff from that, not to have it leave the garden. So that's the only place that I use fertilizer. The yards get nothing. And, I have a few, I like to call them forbs. We have a few broadleaf plants in the yard, but not enough that it bothers us or even the homeowners association, as long as we keep it moving. And you should raise the height on that mower. So even the places that I mow, I keep my mower platform hiked up as high as it will go. Now what that does is it keeps the growing point. It's even good for Bermuda grass. It keeps the growing point beneath where you're clipping. So you don't scalp your lawn, which actually reduces the vigor of your plant. The higher you can raise it, the better off you are. And I don't know if you're like us, but we have water restrictions. And most places in Texas do. We don't fertilize our yard and we don't water it. Even the Bermuda grass, we don't. Not only does that save on your water bill, but if the Texas plant needed water other than what they got naturally, they wouldn't be here. So you shouldn't be planting plants that won't live without watering. And there are some native plants that do require some water. But again, take a look at your soil and take a look at what will grow and what won't grow in terms of shade, in terms of water needs, and try to plant those that can get by on as less water as possible, or at least that the water that you plan to use and the amount. So Doug Ptolemy says, get on the map. And you go to the website, Homegrown National Park, and you can hear him talk. He's a whole lot more eloquent than I am. But he again will make the point that we need to do this. And the reason why is because we're losing habitat and it is fragmented. We went over that last time. Our current habitats are fragmented. So again, he has this concept, if we all do it, we all restore habitat, we'll have a homegrown national park. I read this book, and I'm going to bring everybody back down to earth right now. And I thought, that's a great idea, but we're talking about 40 million acres of turf grass in the United States. How much is that? Well, you read it in a book and you really don't know. So let's say we have 40 million acres of turf grass in the United States, and we're wanting to make a homegrown national park by asking individuals to establish natural vegetation. But it's only on half our yard, right? So that's 20 million acres, let's say. If everybody did it, the most it would be, following his recommendation, would be 20 million acres. So I'm going to go back to this slide that we talked about to begin with in the first meeting. So This is land use in the United States from the 2007 NRI, National Resources Inventory, that the Natural Resources Conservation Service does. And it's the one that every branch of government uses as a basis for how much land there is. So he's saying there's 40 million acres that is in this developed land block. So of 111 million acres, we're saying there's 40 million acres. So we're talking about doing half of that because we're only doing half of our yards. So that's 20 million acres. And in context with the rest of all this, that's a pretty small amount. That amounts to less than 1% of the land in the United States. We're talking about connecting fragmented landscapes. Well, my first thought was that I can't really put that all together and make sense. However, remember what else is going on is that we're not the only ones that are restoring intensively used landscapes. We have, see that number right there? That's Conservation Reserve Program land. That's lands that were in cropland that have been converted to permanent vegetative cover. It began back in 1985 and it went down to like 25 million acres, but now it's up to almost 30 million acres again. That's 2% of land in the United States, along with his 20 million acres. That it's starting to add up. Well, it turns out we have the Wetland Reserve Program. That's another 2.5 million acres. We have the Wildlife Habitat Incentives Program. That's another 1.5 million acres. We have Ducks Unlimited, not a government entity at all, has restored 200,000 acres. We have people like the Nature Conservancy and the Land Trust Alliance, like the Langdons entered their program in too. The Nature Conservancy has over 3 million acres that they've acquired. Now, most of these aren't intensively used lands. Here's where all these other lands that I've talked about before are intensively used. They had to be in cropland or they wouldn't qualify for the program. So you're going from cropland to permanent vegetative cover. So you put them all together and it starts adding up. We're not just defragmenting. We're not just defragmenting America with what he's talking about. We actually could, man could, if they decided they want to, use these programs to establish connections between the fragmented habitats. That makes sense? And we are in a way. And I'm encouraged, not only here in the United States, but in Europe. Have you heard they're rewilding Europe? They have no national parks. We're fortunate in the United States that we have 402 million acres of public land, federal land, that's in some type of natural vegetation. So there are things to connect to here in our country, whereas there's very little in the rest of the world. And how many have heard of the UN Biodiversity Conference? All right, I'm glad somebody does. This has largely gone under the landscape. Now, we're all familiar with the climate accord, right? Wasn't that many years ago where we had climate deniers and people fighting all of the actions that other people that thought it was a problem tried to do. And now we have a lot of people on board with climate change and the conservation of energy. This just took place in December of 2022. And through the United Nations, and there were almost 200 countries that joined into this accord to reduce the amount of natural habitat loss in the world. And it calls for pretty steep goals. Let's look at the goals. It calls for an adoption of an equitable and comprehensive framework matched by resources needed for implementation. And that means dollars. Calls for clear targets to address overexploitation, pollution, fragmentation, and unsustainable agricultural practices. A plan that safeguards the rights of indigenous people, and again, financial assistance. And I love these words right here. And this is by one of the UN Secretary General. Nature and biodiversity is dying a death of a billion cuts, and humanity is paying the price for betraying its closest friend, the earth. In the words of UN Secretary General, we are committing suicide by proxy. This conference of parties must secure the future of our planetary life and support systems. And yeah, I've mentioned it before. We seem to be buying on to conservation of energy resources, but hand in hand, we need natural communities to mitigate. To mitigate the amount of carbon that is being put in the atmosphere. Natural communities and its ability to consume carbon dioxide, convert that to plant tissue, return that to the organic matter, which will eventually be the soil, stores carbon. So that's as big a part of our battle against climate change as any. And I'm glad to see it get attention, if not monetarily, at least in words. So I hope something becomes of it. I never thought I'd see it in my life.